principles, programming, and program design. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for being honest. Okay. So this is just a brief session overview and agenda. So today we'll explore the foundational concepts of equity and anti-racism, gaining a deeper understanding of why these principles are crucial in program design. So we'll do a welcome introduction, we'll go over our objectives, we'll do a brief icebreaker, we'll explore what is equity, diversity, inclusion, we'll introduce equity by design, we'll discuss the importance of equity and anti-racism, and then the foundational concepts of program design. Okay. So when I enter new places and spaces, it's a practice of mine to introduce myself. I like to root myself in connection with the people I'm in a space with. So some facts about me. Again, my name is Denyelle. First and foremost, I'm a wife and a mom. This is my little family here. My little toddler that wreaks havoc on us. We've also moved cities from Toronto to Calgary as of 2021. So this is our second 2 years here. This is our third summer here. I am what the Gen Zs would call a Pilates princess. It is my favorite form of movement. But I actually just recently got into rollerblading or roller skating. Skating is in line, yeah, roller skating. And I love it. So we might have to bump the Pilates princess. I like to consider myself a wine connoisseur, but not really, because we could probably just drop the connoisseur. I just like wine. And then in terms of my educational background is in social justice and community engagement, which informs my practice as an equity design consultant. More than Love Consulting, which is my business name, and we essentially support organizations in aligning their mission, vision, and values with equity, diversity, inclusion principles. So how do we look at equity, diversity, inclusion beyond it being a workshop or a one-time initiative, and how can we actually build it into the design of what we do and how we do it? Our objectives for today. One will be to understand the importance of equity and anti-racism in program design. We'll define key concepts such as equity, anti-racism, and then equity by design. We'll explore the impacts of racism and anti-racist programming. And lastly, we'll again explore those foundational concepts. Right. So very quickly, and I invite folks online to do the same, to share your name, your role, and maybe one reason why you'd be interested in this workshop. You want to go first?
You go first.
Yes.
So my name is Manisha. I work at Immigrant Serving Agency as a partner success specialist. And the reason why I'm interested in this workshop is because I think we need to be more intentional when we design projects, programs, and I like creating things. It's something that I'm trying to push myself to do more on. So I think having the skills to build something that's very inclusive for the people that are building it for, is something that would really benefit. Thank you for listening.
And I feel like your name is super familiar. I feel like I emailed you before.
Yes, Gateway.
Gateway, yes. Awesome. Anyone else? Is there anyone online? My mouse is like, I don't have a mouse, but is there anyone online?
No, they're just experiencing some sound issues. For a second, closer.
Okay. Okay, so what is equity, diversity, and inclusion? So in my practice, I like to think of equity, diversity, and inclusion as guiding principles of how a space or a place should be, right? A space and a place should be equitable, it should be diverse, and it should be inclusive. So with that, we have like the additional acronyms, right? We have accessibility, we have justice, there's so many, and decolonization. And so even sometimes we even shake up where we place the acronyms. There's DEI, DEIA. I hosted a session the other day on IDEA, which is inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. And they are essentially, they mean the same thing. They're all principles, right? So I always like to start with equity. Equity addresses access, i.e. accessibility. And as I mentioned, I did the session on um, I did a session a few weeks ago called The Elephant in the Room. Why is no one talking about IDEA for Board Leadership Calgary? And I had someone respond, I made a post on LinkedIn, and I had someone respond to that post by saying, before we begin the conversation, we have to talk about access, because how can I get to the table? How can I access the table if I can't even get into the building? Yeah. And so that was really profound for me, and why we start with that. We start with equity. Yeah, because we first have to acknowledge the systemic barriers and the gaps that exist that create that inaccessibility. Then we have diversity, which I like to continue to reference the diversity table, right? The people at the table. So this diversity is looking around the room, looking at the space that we're in, looking at that table and being critical about who has access, who are the voices, who's also missing. And then we have inclusion. So inclusion is the policy or the practice, and oftentimes looks like meaningful engagement, discussion, collaboration to ensure that folks feel respected, valued, and empowered to fully participate and contribute. So some examples of this are community conversations, culturally competent programming, etc. Okay. And then introducing equity by design. So how do we do that? How does equity, diversity, inclusion tie into programming? And I use in my practice, equity by design. So, and this is where I see a lot of folks get stuck, because equity, diversity, inclusion are principles of how something should be. It doesn't necessarily include the how-to. So we do the workshops to understand unconscious bias. We might create a policy, we might create a strategy, but how do we ensure that it doesn't just live in text? So equity by design is a strategic approach that incorporates principles of equity, diversity, and inclusion into the design and development of programs, policies, and systems. Having equity at the forefront of the design processes ensures sustainability, intentionality, and lastly, transformation. So this is my absolute favorite quote: "Without community, there's no liberation," by Audre Lorde. And so in my practice, again, we're rooted in co-design and participatory learning models. And this is how we create or we challenge exclusionary design or traditional design frameworks and create inclusive frameworks. And so I do this, I use frameworks that include step-by-step guides that help us, we're introducing equity frameworks. And this actually makes sense. So what I do is I use equity-focused frameworks that usually include step-by-step guides, tools that help us draw from them and then help us into the design process. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay. So for example, you might be familiar with these, right? Anti-racism, trauma-informed care, collective impact, and all of these, if you look into them, they come with literally a guide in how to do that work. But again, equity being at the center, at the forefront. So again, we're familiar with the anti-racist workshops and the initiatives and events, but what about anti-racism in programming? So anti-racist programs are ones that specifically work to address and rectify racism and systemic inequalities for racialized groups. So common characteristics of anti-racist programming is that they're designed to improve well-being for racialized communities. They're educational, or they create awareness. They're advocacy-based. They provide spaces for community engagement. They provide support and or resources. And last but not least, they're culturally competent. So what is anti-racism? So in connection to what we're discussing today, racism is more than words, it's more than actions, it is systemic. They manifest as kinds of barriers, big or small, that prevent access to racialized communities and or groups. So where anti-racism is the policy or practice that acknowledges racism under systemic barriers, and it aims to actively challenge and dismantle. So actually, another one of my favorite quotes by Angela Davis: in a racist society, it's not enough to be non-racist, we must be anti-racist. So for example, in our city, we have many community support programs that while well-intentioned, often follow a general one-size-fits-all. And what makes them inaccessible is that there's a lack of acknowledgement of the barriers that exist. And so to design an anti-racist program, we have to not only acknowledge, but also work to dismantle those barriers. So for example, we have programs in our city that are designed to support certain communities. So we have programming for seniors, for women, or for families. But when you look at those programs and we become critical of who they actually serve, we see that certain groups are reflected in those demographics that they actually serve, or experiences are reflected in that programming. And so it's often clear that those programs are not necessarily diverse, and they're not necessarily meeting their mission of supporting all seniors, all families. You following along? Awesome. And because they don't put in and they may not necessarily put in the fine print, like we only serve these populations, but because they don't acknowledge or work to bridge the gaps, the barriers, or even the interests of racialized groups. When an issue is systemic, especially when it comes to race, it's not enough to just, again, acknowledge, hey, the population, it's not enough to just acknowledge, but actively working to address those gaps. So again, taking what we have all just discussed, how do we do that? Let's say that we're moving along, I've sold it to you, you feel compelled to now design anti-racist programs or anti-racist initiatives, whatever have you, and you want to learn those foundational concepts. So let's get practical. Anti-racist programs, again, are first and foremost delivered by the community that we're trying to target, right? We keep community voices at the forefront of our work, and we empower them to co-create alongside of us. We empower them to co-design, and we involve them in every step. And the 2 sessions that I supported early spoke to these important elements already of community engagement. And again, here, the focus is always on relationship building and trust. That is actually the foundation of this. Then we have our budget. And here we can be critical of what does our budget and our funding streams look like? Do they create barriers for our audience? Are funds allocated to directly benefit those who are impacted, or our program is aimed to support? How can we make transparency? How can we involve, again, the community in decision-making and establish those accountability mechanisms? Then we have our teams. They must reflect the community that we serve. This is how we build culturally competent and trauma-informed programming. Second last, the strategic partnerships. Again, another theme that I heard throughout the day with community leaders, with other organizations. How can we leverage our strengths? How can we leverage our resources, ultimately to, again, support the community that we're designing this program for? Stacy, one of the speakers today, actually said something that really stuck out to me, but if you're experiencing a challenge, how can we lean into that challenge and develop a partnership out of it? So that could look like, she gave the example of permits with the city and how that could be really, really challenging. Well, how can we lean into that, and who do we know from the city, right? Another example that Amanda gave was marketing. We all struggle with marketing. We all struggle with getting folks to attend these programming. But what about collaborating or having a strategic partnership with an organization that is on the ground and has excellent relationships with the community? And lastly, training and capacity building. Oh my gosh, this is so important. how can we look at equipping our teams and our communities with the knowledge that they need to be successful? And I actually have a really great example of this on the next slide. So this is a program called Mental Health First Aid for Black Communities. Again, this is a really great example of anti-racism programming right here in our city. It is actually, I came to know of it through now a good friend of mine, Diana, and her contact information is right here. And this is also sponsored by the Ghanaian Canadian Association of Calgary. And what they do is provide education and training for individuals involved in serving and assisting community members of African descent. And the focus is on integrating an Afrocentric perspective to address mental health concerns. So this program, number one, acknowledges the disparities and the gaps and the challenges that folks of African descent experience. And it works to reduce the stigma surrounding mental health within Black communities. It also empowers Black professionals. It was designed by and then also collaborates with other Black health professionals, I think across Canada. And then in terms of community support, it equips community members who maybe work in, live in, support their community essentially. And then lastly, it is culturally relevant and competent. It uses Black specific case studies and familiar scenarios, like including names and places and spaces. So this is a really great example of an anti-racist programming. Okay. So I spoke really fast and we're at question and answer and discussion. And I'm curious, first and foremost, if there's any questions to start, and then I have some like curiosities and discussion questions that we can engage in. And my apologies for speaking really fast. How's online doing? All right, any questions to start? Yes.
In a city like Calgary that has so many immigrants, has so many cultures and things like that, does that provide any specific unique challenges or opportunities in your mind for this kind of work?
Yes, I think that is actually, I think the opportunity is collaboration. I think the opportunity is, let me go back. I think the opportunity is all of these, right? Now with an influx of so many different people coming into the city, it's an opportunity to start to hire intentionally, start to hire to reflect the communities that we serve. It's an opportunity for community engagement. It's an opportunity to engage community and center their voices. It's an opportunity for strategic partnerships. And with that, I think budgeting is budget and funding is always the most trickiest, especially in nonprofit spaces, because we often have to prove the problem, right? We also have to prove the problem before then accessing the funding. And then once you access the funding, it comes with a whole bunch of stipulations. And sometimes when we talk about systemic barriers, those stipulations are not oftentimes, they don't oftentimes support the communities that we serve, right? We put them in the one size fits all kind of category, and we force them or the communities that we serve to kind of be flexible instead of meeting folks where they're at. Any more questions?
So when you're consulting or supporting a project build anti-racist programming by design, how do you ensure that it's not just stuck in that context and it's actually applied, not just for that 1 month, but ongoing? So what are your tools to ensure that it's moving along and it's not just stuck in words?
I love that question. Okay, so going back to the frameworks. So say, for example, I'm connecting with an organization that is like, okay, we identified that we want to do some equity, diversity, inclusion work. Where do we start? I always point them in the organizational onion. The organizational onion, I actually came to know of it through CommunityWise. They had I think the group that worked on it was called A-Rock. Definitely, I can send you actually some of the really great tools and resources that they've created. But this is where I always start. And essentially, it's like imagine an onion in all the areas, all the layers of an onion. And at the core is your mission, vision, and values. And then it's governance, and then it's policy, and then it's human resources, and then it's programming, and then it's marketing. And so I always start with working with organizations is the mission, vision, and value, and working your way out. The reason why I actually prefer to work with nonprofit or mission or social impact focused organizations is because it's easier to align your mission, vision, and values oftentimes with equity, diversity, inclusion, right? So if an organization's mission is to feed all kids in Calgary, okay, well, that's a very all kids of Calgary, that's a very diverse population. So in order to actually effectively feed all kids in Calgary, you actually have to prioritize this work. And that is, right? So if you want to actually achieve and work towards your mission, vision, and values, this work is necessary. Does that make sense? And so by starting there and working our way out, so everyone is on the same understanding, right? And then we work our way to governance, we work our way through. And so each layer of the onion, we're peeling it back to build equity, diversity, inclusion at that, in that place, space. Any more questions? Any curiosities online?
No.
Sorry. Okay. Okay, so then I would say my question for you is where do you find yourself maybe getting stuck, or what are the challenges that you're experiencing in your work? Or if we look at or if we look at the foundational concepts, where do we see ourselves maybe getting stuck? Or where's there opportunity? Where do we already see opportunity actually?
Talk on the getting stuck. So I work with a very small little not-for-profit, and it's called NSTEP, but we basically are trying to get youth to have healthy habits for life. That's a quick summary. A lot of it's around nutrition, activity, sleep, all that kind of stuff. And as everybody knows, like budget is getting harder. So we don't have any large grants. I think my boss probably gets, writes 40 grants and gets 1 or 2. So we often have little pieces. And like you said, like the barriers or whatever, like I can think of the right words, but that you have to follow. And so we do community work. We also do schools, but it's like you have to prove that this school, like this group or whatever, falls under these parameters. And a lot of it is like our New Canadians is one where you can get some funding. So we often go to that. But I wonder sometimes, like there's also like we're missing other groups when there's like this big focus on people who are new to our country, which I'm not saying that we shouldn't be, but I'm like, sometimes it's hard to access other groups too. So I find the budgeting, like if funders could just say, we trust that you know what you're doing and report it back to us, right? And then here's some money. I don't mind the reporting so much if we could use it a little more freely. So for us, I feel like sometimes we just get really like almost pigeonholed, like just because we don't have we have very little income that like we bring a little like for people who can afford it, we do charge for some of our programming. Just to try to be
like a pay as you can type of, or is it a set amount?
It's kind of a set amount, but it's not very much. Like we do a program where we call it Chef, and so we teach youth some basic skills. In some of our school programs, we went into like sometimes we can get into private schools. It's not a lot that we charge, but it's enough. It's basically enough to cover our costs. That's all we charge. But a lot of groups, funding right now is just such a huge one.
And I'm very familiar with NSTEP. I worked with Deb when I was
Oh, okay.
at Brown Bagging. And I think one thing about NSTEP that I admire is the strategic partnerships element.
We're really trying.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and you can see that. And I think that as we identify those barriers, again, like how can we have to be creative,
Yes.
right? So how can we move around those? And I think we have identified a barrier around budget. How can we leverage our strategic partnerships to work against that or to work alongside that? Yeah.
There's one question online asking if you have any suggestions on trauma-informed care training.
Suggestions? Actually, I do. Whoever that is, I can actually send like a few resources. But I also think that the Black Mental Health First Aid is also another really great. I like to plug that in as another really great one too, because it is trauma informed. However, it is obviously specifically speaking to the Black community, but yeah. There's so many in the city, actually. Any other questions? Oh, and I actually put up a slide for. Her contact is right there. This is an old, yeah, probably not. I could probably copy and paste it in the chat, but this is a super old flyer.
Yeah, I do have one question. Because I feel like for EDI, the practice for a lot of community members, they don't have this kind of awareness or education. I mean, would the CDRA be possible to do more community outreach or community education, bring those free workshops like today to the communities all over recovery?
Like CDLI?
Yeah. Or you, or your consulting company.
So how can we bring this more to the forefront?
Yes.
I feel like that's a challenge that we're also experiencing. Like,
Yeah.
I think a lot of people and organizations have to get to a place, okay, this is the gap. And now let's go on that journey of starting to learn, to relearn. So I think CDLI is an amazing organization that does a lot of community focused work. And I think that we try our best to push or like trainings and things like this. I would also plug our newsletter, because our newsletter has stuff like this that we share. Yes, and if you are a person or organization also doing this work, please send that to us, because we will also share that on our website, our socials, our newsletter, and things like that.
Right, because I think just those strategies or those practice, it need to be more proactive instead of reactive.
Yeah.
And once the crisis happens, we'll handle this process. But then how would you make those first, for example, mental health first aid, the training to educate people, community folks, in the communities, right? I think that's huge. That definitely depends on the lack of staff or funding or other capacity building as well.
Yeah, and even with this program, there's always going to be that, oh my goodness, how are we going to fund this?
Yeah,
funding is the problem. It is the problem. I think that's a whole nother conversation. That is a whole other summit topic.
It's worse now, right? With the economy and.
Yeah. And we see people, suicide rates going up really in our community, right? But the thing is just it's very demanding, like social needs or demanding community needs.
Yeah, and as we see, I guess it is really economics, right? As funding,
it's all related.
Yeah, and we see that, and who suffers at the end of that, right? The communities that we serve.
Yeah, that's right.
Can I just add, so you probably know, so CDLI does evening workshops once a month. So how they have these practitioner ones on Wednesday mornings, they do meetups. And I used to go all the time before pandemic. I was
Yeah,
great.
I know.
And then I did some,
I mean,
so, and I haven't really paid a lot of attention lately to what they are or what the topics are, but email CDLI, email Leanne and just say, like, you know, it's like, because I think they're always looking for new topics. And if there's interest from the community, this could be like a topic for more people, more like, not that you're not necessarily you'll get some practitioners, but also the volunteers, right? Who are just doing the work within whatever community they are in, because they're passionate about it, right? So I think it would be a great topic for a meetup, for an evening meetup.
Oh, I think so, absolutely. And what are the different tips and tricks that folks use to then,
yeah, I totally agree with that.
to
Even
combat
with
that,
the community volunteers, right? How would you make these events more accessible for residents? For example, for people with people in a wheelchair. Yeah, how do you make the avenue more accessible? If you have, you know, ramp, if you have the elevator, if you have any kind of aid for people with you know, the hearing loss, right? A lot of things need to be considered with, you know, details, accessibility, and also accommodation as well. But the thing is, you know, we are professionals, we know how to do it, but the thing is, when educating volunteers in the community, sometimes even for me, I feel like too much work, too much work to be considered, and educate people as well. So definitely we can collaborate as well in the future, for sure.
yeah,
Thanks.
yeah. For sure. Are there any more questions? Yes.
Earlier, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to diverse teams. I know that for me, what I feel like is kind of leads into the budget conversation is there's not people around the table that can see the value in different things. And how do we, you know, for lack of a better word, move from the old boys club, you know, something that even I bump up against, you know, into more diverse teams, and how do we train people to see these different types of value than what we're kind of conditioned to? Because I feel like a lot of when you have the right people who have the authority to make decisions, sometimes that means that the budget can flow or things can be, you know, maneuvered more easily. But it's, to me, sometimes it starts with the leadership and having the right
Absolutely.
understanding.
Governance, leadership, sugar.
Yeah.
This way, you know, you can see from those community center, for the meeting, they're all like white.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
they make her decision.
Yeah, so could you speak a little deeper to that part too, maybe as leading into budgetary and kind of these other big issues, you know?
That's actually what my session on with the elephant in the room. And sometimes the elephant in the room is the lack of diversity at the table. It's the voices that are often heard, and how do we speak to that? So it's tricky though, because when we talk about, okay, because by no means am I like, okay, hire a diverse team. And then there's other things that can come up, such as tokenism, or we skip the step, right? The onion that I talked about. We skip right to, okay, we want to do equity, diversity, inclusion, and we think that we should start at one of the outer layers of our our onion, which is HR or our teams, but we didn't really unpack. We didn't unpack leadership, we didn't unpack governance, and we still haven't even aligned our mission, vision, and values. So what I always like to do is that, like I said, I always like to start at the core. If we want to do if we want to feed all the kids in Calgary, then we need diverse teams. If we want diverse teams, we have to have inclusive culture, inclusive practices, inclusive policy, so that we can sustain our diverse teams, so that our diverse teams can feel comfortable and actually contribute to those spaces that we're wanting them to contribute to. So for example, in that session, we did a case study about, obviously, a board. And so the board was diverse, right? It had young members, it had members from racialized communities, but yet it still felt like a boys club. It still felt like there were certain voices that were amplified more than others. And so what is that? That is kind of going on that the checks and balances of, we need diverse teams, but not necessarily, it's not impactful.
when we're not actually doing it with intention
Mhm.
or sustainability. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Just as an add-on, do you think it's possible to, like, I know you have training capacity building, obviously that's a huge part of it. Do you think that that can be really effective to those people that are kind of like, say, they have their voices amplified more, they might not understand that? Does that for training capacity building
I
help
think
those
so.
people, or does it more help other people learn to have their voice?
I actually recommend that, depending on who you are and how you are entering that space. It actually might not even be safe for you to be like, hey,
Yeah.
there are this table here, like the voices are not diverse, no, like that actually can probably, depending again how you are coming into that space, you may feel uncomfortable, you may feel unsafe, and the list can go on. And so that's why it's always, I like to suggest, again, if there's budget and if there's opportunity to have someone come into that conversation who is not necessarily a part or not necessarily who is literally brought in there to then have those crucial conversations instead of, the only blank in the room, then having that conversation. Yeah. Any more questions?
Yeah, there's one question, I think it's relating to what was just said about whenever you talk about diversity, usually the inclusion aspect is missing. Like in a room, when they say diversity, is you see one person that's maybe a person of color compared to a bunch of white people necessarily, the token person.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's what they consider diversity, but
Yeah.
then the inclusion aspect or the equity aspect of or equality aspect of that doesn't necessarily pertain in that room. So yeah.
Yeah. So I like to, so then there's so many different things. Okay, what is the practice? So if we would say that there is in a room full of one group, and then there's the one from another specific group. I mean, what are the practices that we do to not only acknowledge that there's a disparity there, that there's going to be barriers there, that's also intimidating. How do we include, what are the inclusion practices that we do? By no means am I saying that is diversity, but being critical of what are those inclusion practices. And so then we can draw on the different frameworks to help us, give us those guides, those prompts, those ideas. Yeah. I think that is it for me. What time is it? 41? We have 9 minutes, I think, to spare. So that is all for me, if no one has any more questions. Thank you everyone for joining.